I was very moved when I discovered Omari on my first trip to Nashville a year or two ago, last year. And I went on the Jefferson Street Art Crawl, which was phenomenal. And I saw Omari's work and how he was using his creative outlet and his platform to highlight issues of redlining and gentrification and a lot of the issues that I wasn't aware of in Nashville, Tennessee. And we've talked about everything that glitters isn't gold. Everybody, I love Nashville. It's probably one of my favorite cities in the country. But by discovering Omari the first trip and then reconnecting with him on my second trip where I toured his studio and we spent some time, I gained a bigger appreciation for his work, which I was already a fan of, and seeing it, if you ever go to Nashville, you'll see his work in the airport, which is a big testament. So when we had this platform to bring artists here to speak to our community and raise awareness about issues, I thought of nobody better than Omari to speak about this issue, and I thought of nobody better than Shavara to moderate this discussion because, as you're going to find out, she's probably the best person locally here to do so. So without much further ado, I just wanted to give that introduction, and I thank you guys for being here, and this is going to be a very interesting conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no doubt, I got you.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. So the way this is going to flow, I'd really like this to be a conversation. I'm going to pose a few questions to Omari, but then I want to open it up because this is, when we think about art as an access point, I believe there's redemptive power in the voice of the artist. And so art as an access point, I invite you in with us to be engaged in dialogue as we learn a bit more about Omari. I'm just going to briefly say that I am an advocate of the arts, lover of the arts. I'm a former gallerist and collector, so that's the intersection for me, and had an incredible opportunity to spend some time with Omari yesterday, and it changed my life. And I imagine that all of you will not be the same when we leave today after you hear this incredible journey and be inspired in your own lives. So talking about art as an access point, and artists throughout the ages have used their work and their own lived experiences as a means of social, cultural, and political critique and change. So what I'd like to invite you to share with us just a little bit about your background, what inspired you to become an artist, or I guess not become an artist, rather what inspired you to fulfill your destiny, that you were supposed to be an artist. I think that's probably a better way of framing it. And then as you're talking about that, the flow of experiences that have shaped the views in the work that you're going to share with us today, and then where was the process for you where you turned your interior feelings towards outward expression?
Absolutely. Well, for one, thank you all for being here, and I know it's taking some time out of your day, so I appreciate that. And Evan, for having me. It's been a real family experience being down here and getting to know Shavara, Evan, Andrew, all the people that put this together. So yeah, it's a special place. I'm glad to be here, first of all. But yeah, I think art as an access point is it's interesting to think about a way to express that anyone can do. It's like no matter where you are in society, no matter what level of status, if you create something and put it out there into the world, you can express something about yourself, your experience, what you've been through, what you think. That's all part of what we as artists have always done, and it doesn't really matter where you fall on the scale of the haves, have-nots, etc., where you are, whether you're a free person and an incarcerated person. All of those, there's always that space to express and share your view. And so I think that's what you'll see in this work is this has been my perspective on the life that I've lived, where I grew up, what I've observed. And so that's sort of the beginning.
So take us through just a little bit, because I could tell you about Omari, but I really think that it's so much better hearing in his own voice the experience that led you to create.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And kind of briefly, my first art class was my senior year of high school. So I didn't really know that art was something that I was passionate about or invested in. It was something that I kind of found a little bit later. And as I started kind of creating regularly and went on and did traditional majors. I had a math major for a while. I eventually changed majors, went to graphic design and studio art, but it wasn't like an immediate thing that I knew I was an artist. I mean, my mom, who is in the room, she definitely took me to museums and galleries and stuff as a kid, and I was exposed to it enough to know that I was interested in it. But there's also that overcoming the stigma of, is this a career? Is this something that you could do long term? And as I grew and sort of found what things drove me, what wakes me up in the morning, what can really be a savior, regardless of what situation you're in, art became that thing. I mean, a critical turning point was late 20s. I had a drug felony and arrest, and ended up serving 3.5 years in prison, and that was a big turning point as far as, regardless of what art did externally, as far as whether I sold it or showed it to anyone, I found the internal therapeutic, the therapeutic effect of it. Yeah, the spiritual effect of it. That reality that you can be free regardless of circumstance. If you, hey, you have that sketchbook with you. It's an outlet that's like nothing else, and that's whether you're a painter, a singer, a dancer, whatever that artist is in all of us, because it's in all of us. You were 3 years old and somebody gave you a box of crayons. You didn't say, "Oh, but I can't draw." No, you drew. That's what you did. That's in there. That's born in you.
So, when we were talking yesterday, and I thought it was interesting, because one of the things that you shared is that we're all incarcerated by something, right? And I would imagine that all of you out here today, there's something, right, that's holding you back, holding you in, holding you from something, might be holding you from yourself. So I'd really like to explore more this notion of freedom in your work, and how you found that in a space where clearly you weren't free, you were bound. And we'll see some of the work that we'll see a little later on kind of speaks to that. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that freedom of expression through your work, and just finding that freedom, and how do you move from pain to power?
Well, I think they're tied. I think you've got to experience it, because there is something for everyone. Everyone's got that relationship, or it might be a child, it might be a parent, it might be a social construct, sexual orientation. There's any number of things that could be incarcerating in a life, and that I think that liberation, part of it is dealing with it, is looking at it. The power doesn't come without the pain. You can't skip the pain, and that's the joy, the joy of even being able to create in regards to whether it's for a living or not, but be able to create regularly. The joy of that is partly coming out of the pain of the circumstances that led to it. And so yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, when we were talking yesterday, we discovered that we had a common point around incarceration. I shared with you that as a little girl, I would visit my stepfather in prison, who had also been arrested on a drug charge, and outside of the dehumanization of being searched by guards and all that comes with that trauma, once we walked through what I refer to and called kind of this portal, you did see artists, and you saw artisans, and you saw families really engaging and loving each other kind of despite those confines. So what I'd like to do is we're going to show a few of his works, talk a little bit about Redline, have a few more questions, open it up. We're going to pause after we show a few pieces of work, because I want you, if there's some questions, you have to be able to answer those. And we do have one special question that I'll pull up on my phone from Italy that came to me via Facebook a couple of days ago. So we'll be asking that question in a few moments. But for those of you who may be unfamiliar, this entire series, Redline, in 1934, there was government-sanctioned policy that kept black people dispossessed and minoritized and marginalized in terms of where we would live. And so there were a series of policies put into place, and there were literally red lines drawn where people could and could not move. In 1968, that was abolished by the Fair Housing Act, but that did not stop generational cycles of poverty and large disparity in wealth. A new study just came out recently, billions of dollars in the disparity around home ownership between white and black people. And so I think it's fascinating that Omari has chosen not just Redline as a policy in place in this nation that still has direct impact now, but red line, as you'll see in the work. So I'd like you to share with us some of the early works, and then what that is, how that's segueing into some of your current work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I looked at the ability to purchase a home and all that means as far as where you go to school, who you play with, what your socioeconomic, mobility is, and how with redlining being law, I mean it's federal law and it's not obscure. I mean the law specifically states Negroes are aliens. I think at that time period, that's what so basically an immigrant of color or a black or brown person couldn't live in certain spaces, but inside of the red line, they could. So just kind of thinking about that in terms of how much that can touch every aspect of your life just by where you can live. I mean, even myself as an artist, part of why it's a good idea to have this artwork in these luxury homes is because people with luxury homes have the income to that's it, and so just by virtue of who you come in contact with has so much to do with how your life might move, at least within the system that we live. So that was the initial idea, and I surrounded it with razor wire. So if you see the actual pieces, which are one of the homes during at the art fair, and we'll kind of tell you which home they are. But it's razor wire that I spray painted red to show the red line, and then just on the inside the flesh tone of a person of African descent, basically any black or brown person, and then on the outside the kind of peachish flesh tone, which was sort of that ability to live anywhere you wanted. It's like, of course, you could still live in a black neighborhood as a white person, but you didn't have to. And so that was, and how that fast forwarded today, where we look at areas like Jefferson Street in North Nashville, where the mobility is different now, and so people do kind of move into areas with these homes that the value has kind of been killed over the years, but purchased at low rates and then built into a nicer place to live. Like, I mean, gentrification is a child of redlining, and so that was kind of just where the idea started. And then I in thinking about just whether it's pain, suffering, universal struggle, basically thinking about the reality that regardless of what skin tone you are, you're gonna struggle. If you're born and you live, then there's no getting around it. Pain is part of the deal. And so I kind of created a piece with that flesh tone to illustrate that struggle. And then growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, where I mean a lot of the environments that I was in, I was one of the few black kids. And when I was in predominantly black environments, I could see how that struggle when it came to race was really prevalent. So I made another piece to illustrate that the struggle is for everybody. The struggle, as specific to race, gets deeper the darker you get, And we even talked about that in our experience, where you as a brown person with, you're struggling in certain areas. The further that you get on the scale, as it comes to race, we talked about that yesterday.
That proximity to whiteness. I have a white Jewish mother, so we were talking about that, talking about colorism within the black community, what proximity to whiteness looks like as we kind of walk through and navigate. Curious if you would share with us the significance of the razor wire. I know I think about razor wire, and I think about where I see it, right? We see it around penal farms. Sometimes we see it around in poor neighborhoods. People are keeping dogs enclosed, but it certainly doesn't connote something that's positive or joyful. So can you talk a bit about your selection of razor wire?
Yeah, I mean, I would guess if a wall is ever built around the country, there's going to be some razor wire around the top of it. I'm just saying, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, razor wire, because it's abrasive, it's violent. I mean, working with it, I mean, I cut myself sometimes. Even though I wore gloves, I cut myself just randomly. If it touches you, it cuts you. And so the razor wire was illustrating, if you want to maintain that class system. I mean, I could have put a red ribbon around it,
Sure.
but it's not enforced with a red ribbon. It's enforced with bats and bullets. You know, it's
Right.
enforced with prison, and you know, in the South, it was enforced with Klansmen. So the razor wire was the most appropriate thing that I could find to attach to it to say, no, this is what it feels like. It's not just you sit over here and you sit over there. It's you sit over there, I'm going to kill you.
Right.
You know.
You know, it's interesting when I was looking through some of your work, and I was thinking about how it really does reinforce this historical erasure, right? This erasure of marginalized communities and those who are most invisible among us, because you talked about the incarcerated. We're talking about folks living in poverty. So can you show the next? I want to
Sure.
go into and talk about, and I think you have a couple of others that have
Yeah,
some.
absolutely.
Yes, okay, right. So yes, let's talk about this one, because I found this really fascinating. And you're talking about, too, the otherness of someone, so the othering of this particular man in the piece.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. He was in the U.S. military, I mean, in the late 1800s, and he was a decorated soldier who actually killed a couple of Native Americans who were trying to steal some, I think they were stealing horses from a community, like a community, a predominantly white community at that time. But just how interesting it was that he was a decorated American soldier who, I mean, he can't go to the restroom and say, you know, he didn't have any of the rights, even though he was. And I mean, that's, you know, the military is full of that story. I mean, redlining was a part of that wealth disparity was, you know, post World War, when the loans were given as basically a big part of that was, thank you for your service. Here's that loan. So a couple of generations later, you know, after my house went down to be my kid's house, went down to be their kid's house, then that kid's is paid for. You know, like but the African American military didn't, you know, weren't afforded that same gift of service, basically. Yeah. So yeah.
We have what, maybe two more in this series?
Yeah. This was kind of looking at just family, the effect on black families at that time. I mean, also today, you know, redlining, mass incarceration, it's all under the same umbrella. And a gentleman talked about how he kept his house, even though his house was under contract and had a ridiculous mortgage. And, you know, we can talk more about what a house under contract looks like, but he managed to keep his house, but he was never there because he had 3 jobs, and if he defaulted on 3 loans, he lost the whole mortgage. He could be paying the mortgage for 15 years, default 3 months, and they take it off. So even though he kept the house, he never spent time with the wife, he never spent time with the kids, because he was working just to barely maintain with absolutely no room for error. And I mean, in that story does cross the color lines. I mean, there are a lot of people that are working just to barely maintain,
Right.
and they
don't see
their kids, they don't
Right,
see the
don't see their
wives,
kids,
because
don't
they're
see
just.
their families.
But in that particular moment, it was and is, and with 1 in 3 black men going to prison at some point in their life, that's 33.3% that won't vote either ever or for a really long time. I know some rules in Florida some laws in Florida just changed.
We just had some change, and it's going to be interesting right over the next couple of years to see how that actually comes into play, because now it's not just a matter of, so now we're talking about, for those of you who are unfamiliar, not from Florida, people who are coming out, are re-entering citizens now have restorative voting rights. But, you know, it's more than a notion to restore those rights. People who've been incarcerated, particularly for a very long time, they're coming home and they just want a job. I mean, they're not trying to figure out, they don't know who they should vote for, but they also are not interested necessarily.
Yeah.
That's not their first priority. It's how do I take care of myself? How do I take care of my family?
Yeah.
If it's not been fractured like you have shown in here, how have you engaged, how have you noticed or observed viewers engaging with this particular series?
It's all different ways. I mean, there have been people that have really sat with it. I love seeing kids look at it, you know, because they're the most perceptive and the most open. but people engage for a long period of time and kind of wonder if it's real. Like, is that real razor wire? Can I touch that? And will it actually cut me? Or it's really brief. And I think that's how, as a culture, we engage with race. I mean, it's like either there are the few that engage and sit with it, and then there's a lot of people that are like, oh, race, hey, better change that subject. Let me get to the next room. And so I've seen people sit with it, and I've seen people kind of run from it. Yeah.
And so thinking about that and thinking about art activism too. I mean, because you've clearly chosen to be an activist through your work, and it doesn't mean that everything you'll always create, but the pieces that you've shown me. So can you talk a little bit about yourself as an arts activist, and when you first began creating art, were you even conscious that this is activist work? And it's clearly, it's different than like organizing, and whether that's creating strategy for a movement, whether that's organizing for a march. It's a different, in my mind, it's a different way to organize and to really challenge people to think beyond and to do something. In my mind, your work calls me to act. It calls me to action. It's not, I'm just not a silent viewer. I'm not an observer. It is calling me to engage and then to take some action.
Absolutely. And I never intended for the artwork to be activist work. Like I don't shy away from that term, arts activist, but that was never the intent. It was reflecting the world as I saw it. And that's what I think all artists try to do is you take a look at the world and you say, how can I most honestly put that back? And I even think about that when I'm creating work. I'm not trying to make shock art. I'm not trying to make work that shocks you into believing something that isn't there. I'm saying this is the way I see it. And I think that where that is activism is, I would guess some of the youngest people in the room are these two young people right here. And so it's activism because it could light something up in them, and they go to school, and when something happens, they say, nah, but I don't know, man, there's got to be more to that, or they learn something that might be taught in a class, because a lot of this wasn't taught in classes. I never heard anything about redlining until I was 30-something, So I think it's activism in that it can spark something that might say, well, I might go ahead and just be an organizer, even if it's one day a month. I could go visit a prison and see what it really looks like to live in a completely different experience. So I think that's what I would hope that it would do, would be to spark an idea.
There seems to also be, when I'm looking at your work, this really complex intersection between bodies and landscape, right? Because we're thinking about redlining, and when you think redlining, you think neighborhoods, you think communities, you think houses, you think streets, not necessarily paved with gold, but littered with glass and crack pipes, depending on what neighborhood you're in. But then you've also got bodies engaging. So just curious if you talk a little bit about, for you, kind of what's that process when you're thinking about the bodies that are in your pieces, but then also the landscapes and the intersection.
Yeah, and I think the landscapes are important, but they're not that important. There's black people never own, I don't want to say never is a very broad term, but rarely owned those neighborhoods they inhabited. Like the community was the people. Like it was that if me, you, and you were there, that was it. Like that was the church, that was the party, that was the community, that was the that's why, whether 5 guys are playing basketball in their neighborhood or they're playing for Duke, the rest of Duke's campus don't look like them. But in that locker room, this is us. Like this is, and so the bodies were so important because that was a community. That was kind of the only thing you really had, in some circumstances. That's not a blanket statement, but for me, and then with the prison experience, you don't own anything. It's all state issued. So
when we were talking yesterday, I was asking Omari. I said, because again, I have this experience going to a penal farm, and I was sharing with you that one of my fondest memories, actually, and there are fond memories of this penal farm experience I had. My stepfather had a painter inside those walls create an oil painting using our school photos, and they were huge. Really, really large. And I was asking you, especially for the young folks in the room, where were you even getting your materials and supplies? Because it's a very complex, our prison system is very complex, and it's clearly, it further exploits people, not just who are in prison, but exploits those families too connected. So Do you mind sharing even how you had access to be able to create the work that you did?
Yeah. I mean, as far as art supplies, it was just being creative. You know, you'd get grease pencils from the kitchen. You would get aprons and take an apron and stretch it and make a canvas with like half of an apron and a piece of cardboard. I mean, some people that are in prison now have been there since the 80s, and so they have old paint and stuff from when there were more programs and more things that were allowed in. So, and then even officers. I mean, a prison is just a city inside a city. So, I mean, you get to know certain officers, and they found out you could draw. They said, "Hey, draw me something. I'll bring you some paint." You know, and so you draw me something. I'll give you an extra 20 minutes on the phone or whatever. So yeah, it's you can't go to Michael's, of course, but I did a lot of work. I mean, especially pencil, grease pencil, a few paintings. So yeah.
Before we move on to this series, I want to open it up. Are there any people that any folks have some questions, something burning that you want to share? Any thoughts? I know you do. This is just, I see it in your eyes. Yes.
As you're going through, you went kind of quickly by a piece that looked like a basketball.
For sure.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah. This is called "Do You Play Basketball?" ? And I don't know if y'all see me stand up yet, but I've got that question
all the time.
Yeah, I told somebody if I had a dollar for every time I got that question, I could quit painting, or at least not have to worry about selling any of them. But yeah, just that interesting relationship with sports, with sports and with sports and race, basically. And on one hand, it's one of the most unifying things for teams, especially. Teammates. Once you're on a team, a lot of that goes away. At least for that common goal of winning that game. It can also be damaging in certain areas when that is like that's it. Like if that's your ticket. It's not you could be an artist, a doctor, a lawyer, or a basketball player. You could be a basketball player, and that's pretty much the only way out of this red line. And so that's part of what kind of came up for me with it. But I've had some really insightful interpretations of all of these, and I know I think sometimes I give a bit of a disservice by telling exactly what was in my head because somebody else has something that's really that's really good. But yeah, give me any feedback that you might have just by looking at it. Yeah.
Oh, I guess I thought the same thing. Is it a statement of denial of other opportunity, of over-prescribing to someone wherein their opportunity lies? Mm-hmm. Is there a denial of the daring to dream about success in other areas? And that's trapping of people.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which also, it's interesting because it ties back to that theme of incarceration, right? So incarcerated in our own thoughts. And when I think about, you said something that really landed on me when you were talking about unifying, and you were talking about a team, but we've heard that Sundays are like the most segregated spaces day in our nation, right? Mm-hmm. But on a football field, on a basketball court, you've got all of these bodies. They're black bodies and white bodies and Latino bodies and Asian bodies, and there are generational differences in these bodies, and for that couple of hours, people are unified, and then you watch them when they walk off that court or away from that court or away from that stadium, mm-hmm. and they go right back into those separate spaces immediately. I mean, it's not even in the parking lot. I mean, you may see a high five every now and then, but almost instantaneously, mm-hmm. people go right back into that space. So I also think in all of these works, it's really powerful that the pink flesh tone that's surrounding, mm-hmm. which is still this reminder that there are some limitations, there's some marginalization, some minoritization going on in these spaces. Any other questions or thoughts?
I just want to add, for me, what it brought to mind was that recent controversy where someone said to LeBron James, "Shut up and play basketball."
Yeah, shut up and dribble.
Right.
Shut up and dribble.
Have no thoughts outside of this, no political perspective.
So again, restricting who you are.
Right.
As a whole person in the world.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, thank you for that. Thank you both. Thank you both for that.
Yeah, and I mean, just one last. Oh no, go ahead.
I remember when I was at the Jefferson Street Art Crawl and you were speaking about a piece, and you said, and there's a developer in the room, but he's not one of the bad ones.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Fort Lauderdale is going through a big development boom right now, and with our arts district being alongside our historically African American neighborhoods and warehouse complex, we've witnessed and seen the development, unfortunately, inevitably going to push our arts district out.
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by he's a developer, but he's not one of the bad ones?
Yeah, I mean, I'd mean it the same as if I was sitting with a room full of preachers and said he's a preacher, but he's not one of the bad ones. You know, some might have the Cadillac and have be a pimp and a preacher. But not this one. And so I basically just meant that it's there's a way to be equitable, to be fair, and to really look at how you can use your platform. Like if you're a developer, you can use that to make the community as equitable as you can, and some of that is not only doing things on what is perceived as a level playing field. Some of that is drastically shifting it to make sure that the people with less have an opportunity. Because if you just say, "Oh, it's all even. We're going to sell everything for $450,000," that's even. It's not even.
No.
And it's partly why it's not even is because that red line that happened, 70 years ago has gave that financial head start to some that. So as a developer, you could say, "Yeah, I'm gonna make this here. I'm also gonna make sure that there is space for the people that help make this an attractive place to live." Because part of the reason why people flock to all that culture is the culture.
And I know not all developers are bad, because the mural that you sent me to check out in North Nashville by the North Crew that ended up getting picked up in Thrillist, that was a project that was developed that I believe I read is still reasonably priced.
Absolutely,
Right.
It is. Yeah.
And they used the walls to paint a mural in this neighborhood. So not all developers are bad.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you clarified.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the thing. You use whatever platform you got. I mean, if you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, we're all doing something in the world that can help, make things a bit more. Just can make it a better place for everyone. Yeah.
Amen.
Yes.
Where I find art powerful is not so much in activism, because activism scares a lot of people. Where I find art powerful is when it puts a question mark in the stereotypes you have in your own head. And it's not necessarily a racial stereotype. It's a stereotype of ideas. And this is how powerful your art is, because you understood the medium. That barbed wire that you use speaks in so many ways that are not so evident immediately. But the more you see it, it comes together. So I really, I commend artists, because I spent 25 years promoting art globally for the environment. And it is truly the universal language, whether you're a writer, whether you're a painter, whether you're a dancer, and so on. So thank you for that.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting, because those ideas are activism too. And when I think about, and that's exactly what activism is, right? And whether the word activism scares people, and I think that we have to be willing to have those courageous conversations. I don't think we can afford, not in this moment, and certainly not in past moments, to not, what do they say? Call a thing, right? Call a thing a thing. And so when we think about, and you were mentioning environmental, I think about the environmental activism that I see in art, especially here in Florida. For those of us who live here in Florida, whether it's Red Tide, whether it's Beaching of Whales, every moment. There are lots of artists here, even as part of Art Fort Lauderdale. There was a talk the other day was about that too. So thinking about, so thank you for that, though. I really appreciate your comment.
It's important because semantics is important.
It is.
The word activism isn't used in the way that I think you're interpreting it. I think when the average person, artists are creative people.
Right.
They are the ones who go beyond the obvious. That's why they're creators.
Yes.
You create because you're not doing something that's obvious. You're not a creator if you're doing the same thing over and over.
That's right.
And that's why artists are powerful in many ways. The scientist is an artist.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Do you understand?
Yes, that's
So
right.
It's
That's
really
right.
important to be clear when we talk about creating.
Yes.
That's what artists do. They create out of the ordinary.
That's right.
if you will.
That's right.
So
No,
I
thank
want-
you.
Yeah, so I
No,
want
thank
to
you for that.
clarify.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Want to go to the Eeny, Miny, Mo series? I love this series.
Yeah, thanks.
It belongs to someone, so I can't acquire this series. But would you go ahead and talk of? So this and this resonated with me. I'll let you talk about it first, and then I'll share the connection point.
Yeah. So I guess really briefly, I met these three kids on Jefferson Street, and I also that's the area of North Nashville where I do a lot of work. But I also got these what am I trying to say? Burglar bars off of houses. I didn't get them off of houses, but houses were torn down in that area. And the discarded windows and burglar bars, I hung on to those to I didn't know why I had them for a long time, but eventually it figured out why I wanted those. But anyway, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, just speaking to the 1 in 3 black males that are incarcerated or will be incarcerated in their lifetime. And so when I was seeing these kids that live in the neighborhood as you know, 3 young black kids, 1 out of the 3 is statistics go, 1 out of the 3 has got to go, and that has been that's rang true. It's not just an out there statistic. It's an actual that really is the case. Also, the zip code where they live is the most incarcerated zip code in the country, which is in Nashville. That's 37208, which I didn't know until after the series, but I just found that it was really strange that a pretty just regular, safe, predominantly black neighborhood was the most incarcerated in the whole nation. But I'm going to go through these just kind of briefly, and then we can discuss it. And in that installation, Mo is a mirror, and so when you kind of go through the 3 kids, the 4th one, you'll see a mirror where you can see yourself in the piece, and that hopefully will bring a level of proximity that if you think about yourself being in the situation that these kids, inevitably find themselves in, then hopefully that will spark something. That'll make you want to change something when you can see yourself in it.
Yeah. Will you share where this work is and the relationship you have?
Yeah, it is Marion Wright Edelman. She founded the Children's Defense Fund. She purchased these and it's in their office in DC now. And so that was great. I got to ship it up there and go spend some time with her, and it was really, really just a treat to kind of be around someone who's been fighting this fight since before I was alive, since way before I was alive.
And it resonated with me.
Don't tell her I said way before.
Way before. Yeah, she's fierce. It resonated with me. My father was one of the inner circle of Dr. King, and some of the SNCC students who were in D.C., Charlie Cobb, who was at Howard, they left and went down to Mississippi and created these freedom schools. And the freedom schools became the basis for the work that Marion Wright Edelman is doing in D.C. now. And so for me, it resonated because here we are talking about incarceration and freedom. I mean, those freedom schools were specifically created to teach black children about our history. And because they weren't getting educated in the schools in a proper way, you think about even what happened with integration. And while on one hand, there is value, certainly in integration, but we lost a lot in black communities. We lost black teachers. We lost the connection. We lost walking into a classroom and someone saying, boy, you gonna graduate.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make sure you're gonna graduate
Yeah.
because I see you as my nephew, as my son. And so it's interesting, this particular body of work, when I think about the basis of her work, where they sit now, and there's such power, and the universe makes no mistakes. So the fact that this series of work, right, that shows incarcerated youth, and then that last piece, that last work of art that allows people to see themselves and more deeply reflect, not just about seeing themselves in prison, but what's their responsibility to ensure that we don't continue this cycle, I think is a larger looming question.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a humbling and special experience, and also just as an artist, it's not necessarily making work for, commercial gain. Not that, not that people don't buy it, not that I hope that people don't buy it. People buy it, but, there are definitely times when, you're in the studio with a razor wire, like, who the hell is going to put this in there? You know, who's going to put this in the house? But if, you know, just I think it was just really, really special that people that see that and say, no, I'm going to invest in you as an artist. I'm going to invest in what you're doing. You know, one, because they like the work, but also because they know, like, that's part of the engine. Like, that's part of continuing to do what you love is to
to have that support.
To have that support, not only financially, but just emotionally, in that if someone says, that they see it.
Because you reflect their pain.
Yeah,
Just
right.
like you
sure.
said, people don't articulate their pain very often, and you do that for them.
Right, right. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's so much truth. I mean, you're a truth teller. I mean, I see artists as our truth tellers. They're in some ways, are gatekeepers. They're our truth tellers. And let's go on to the next slide.
For sure.
Looking at checking our time.
Yeah. I mean,
So this is So when we were looking at work, I mean, I wanted to explore some of the other mediums that Omari is working with too, so that you could see the wide range and scope of his work, and then also talk a little bit about, with this piece, your evolution as an artist. And what we've seen thus far is, I imagine, at least my perspective and my perception of it, is we are seeing the world as you see it, as it is. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about work that you may have created already, or that you might be contemplating creating, that shows this other world that you imagine if these oppressions didn't exist.
That's interesting. I mean, this for one, if you don't know, now you know.
Now you know.
This
Everybody may not be familiar with who this is.
With that line, this is the late great Biggie Smalls, but but Notorious Big. I mean, huge hip hop fan, and that is, you know, a medium that fuels that studio. I mean, when I go in there, I crank it on, and whatever someone's music is, they know that when they hear that, it's a certain type of energy that they get from it. And it was interesting, like in 1994, he came out with his first album. In 1996, Jay-Z came out with his first album. Also in 1996, my dad gave me a Bible, so it was like this was kind of my dad's saying, like, okay, this is what the world's all about. And I'm also like, I don't know, but Jay said it's about this, man. I think this is what the world's all about, you know. And so I collaged my dad's Bible into this panel and painted painted Biggie on that and called it Kingdom Come, because it's all connected. It's all spiritual stuff. So
yeah, this piece, it's fascinating to see up close. I mean, some of it. So I'd love for you to have a chance afterwards. I don't know. Afterwards, if we have a couple of moments to go back to this slide, because for those of you, I think you'll find it fascinating to see what parables he pulled out and kind of the text that are in this piece. So talk a little bit about your evolution as an artist.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the idea for what you see in the future, like what you see when none of this exists. And someone asked me once, they said, if we could erase all this, how would you do it? I'd say everybody that's over 2 years old, kill them and leave enough food out for them to grow up. That's it. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. It sounds bad. But see,
sounds a little bit like genocide.
But I'm like, with the amount of stuff that is baked in already, you know, we can just start working with it, and we can work with each other, and we can get a little better. You know, from Marion Wright Edelman got a little further than Harriet Tubman, and you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates got a little bit further than James Baldwin, and I hope I get a little bit further than, you know, than Basquiat or whoever. I'm not putting myself in that category, but I'm just saying I just hope that we keep on getting a little bit further, and that's what people's work does. You know, there was with the whole thing with the sports. I mean, the sports and activism. You know, I don't really care what side of the Colin Kaepernick situation you were on, but it's important because it is pushing something forward. It's like that's the only way that you move forward. So I don't see there being I don't see there necessarily being an end to it. I see that it can move, it can keep moving, and I know that the work that my parents put me in a position to even be able to make artwork for a living. Like that wasn't, my grandmother wasn't telling my mom go paint. Right. She was telling my mom get a job, you know. But my mom telling me go paint. Like that's incredible evolution
and that's freedom,
in that.
Right? There's freedom in that too. So I think it's really interesting when we think about, again, going back to these themes of incarceration and freedom. There's incredible freedom and saying, you know, tell your truth, live your life. You talked yesterday a little bit about the stripped down sense of self too, when you're in the midst of creating your work and thinking about. Has anything shifted for you drastically in the last couple of years as you've been honing your craft and creating your works?
Yeah, the way that I interact with the world, I mean, attempting to be more honest with the world, just like I'm honest with artwork, that shifted. And I mean, that shifted in relationships and, you know, personal relationships with whether it's parents or, you know, former wife or whatever. I think that part of it is just really looking at everything as critically and expressing, you know, because there's a lot of, I know there was a lot of time spent making other people feel comfortable, like stand up real quick. So like when you walk around the world like this, you spend a lot of your time like just trying to like say, yeah, I'm not any harm, you know? And so just kind of getting comfortable saying like, yeah, I don't really have to make you comfortable, you know?
Right, which has
been
right.
like, that is that's relearning the whole way that I move through the world. And so that's kind of been,
and there's power in that, right? There's also another layer of freedom in that when you're at that place where you're not apologizing and you're not limiting or making yourself smaller. And I don't mean in stature, but I mean here, making yourself smaller. We're closing in on our time, but I did want to. Did you have toe tag on the body back then?
Oh, it is here, but it's not on this slide.
Oh, it's not on the slide. Okay.
But we can chat. We can ask a question.
Yeah. There's just one more series that I want him to show, but I want to open it up for some questions, some dialogue, some thoughts, some inspiration.
I had a question.
Yes.
For Mark, as far as you said you went to prison.
Yes.
How did you, coming out, deal with that and utilize your artwork to help you get through with that so you wouldn't end up in prison?
Well, I used my artwork to make sure I didn't go crazy when I got out. To make sure I didn't go back, I just, you know, it was one day at a time. And really for me it's grace. Like there's not any I don't have any recidivism potion. Like people go back because there aren't options when they get out. You know, when I got out, my parents had a place I could stay, you know, an employer had a job, you know, so yeah, I mean, I had to work whatever, 8, 9, 10, 12-hour days, you know, whatever. You have to be pretty keyed in, but the art was more the emotional thing where it's like, I know that this sustained me there, and so what more could it do when I'm here? And I use it, you know, the same way. Like, yeah, if something serious happens, you know, I'm gonna paint that day. I'm probably gonna paint that day anyway, but I'm gonna paint with a little more if it's been a hell of a situation. So yeah, I think recidivism has a lot more to do with the opportunities that you give people that have already had very slim chances. Because a lot of people that get there, they didn't get there, you know, on the heels of, you know, a lot of money and a lot of resources in the best schools. You know, they got there on the heels of, you know, being expelled as a 8-year-old and then being arrested as a 12-year-old for loitering and like that. That's the kind of so yeah, correcting all that, and that's a society. Like a business owner, if somebody's coming out, don't throw out their application because that's gonna be the person that's gonna work harder than anybody in there. Like you want to say you got something to prove. You got something to prove when you come home, and nobody wants to go back. Like that's the thing. Everybody wants to stay out. Yeah. So.
Any other questions, thoughts? Thank you for that. Yes.
I have something. So, you know, Omari is a good friend, and I've interviewed him several times over the years. I'm a writer, and one thing that I don't think a lot of people know about, and he's a very humble person, but he's like an excellent business person, and has just a really open mentality as far as taking opportunities as they come. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that's so important for artists to have people to look up to, you know, to know how to make money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you definitely have to be you have to be a business person. You know, you gotta, you know, if someone wants to buy something, you gotta give them a price. You know, there are a lot of artists that, you know, they make a piece of artwork and they say, well, someone says, how much is that? Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm kind of trying to put that in a. It's like, no, sell that thing. You know, it's not gonna keep coming in. Because the person that wants it, you know, you might pass them up, and then you never know when the next person's gonna come. And so yeah, I mean, I think as far as business goes, I don't think much about it while I'm creating the artwork, but after I make it, I try to find as many avenues, as many people, as many, you know, relationships, and also I'm not afraid to say, like, this costs something. Like, if somebody asks me to do an event, yeah, you gotta pay me. Did you pay for the chairs and the food and the bartender? You're gonna pay for the artwork, you know.
Right.
So yeah, I mean.
Yeah, because he didn't hesitate when I told him I was the 3 pieces I was interested in. I said, send me dimensions and send me price, and he sent it right over.
That's
absolutely,
it.
No, absolutely.
Last night.
Last night. No, I got it. I didn't think 15 minutes later, I think I had it, and that's important. And we were talking a little bit about that yesterday when I was a gallerist. That when my then husband and I opened our gallery, I didn't talk to other gallerists. I talked to artists and wanted to know, you know, what would be ideal for them and what would that relationship look like. And I had been living in Atlanta, so had a wide range of incredible Black artists, African artists that I was working with, and I do think that's important. And so how we show up as community to support artists. There's one other point that I know we're closing in on time, and I do want to have time for one more question. But there was something that you said yesterday, because this entire, when I think about the title of this talk, especially going into this 2-piece series, you talked about that there's a tendency to make race the symptom when it's really the disease. And I think that this piece, these two works. So to talk a little bit about that as you explain these two.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for me, I think that so many of the issues that we discuss, and I apologize for the way that these kind of present, but really briefly, this is All Lives Matter, and there's an actual toe tag that's adhered to this piece. And if you kind of look at the punctuation, it's in All Lives Matter with a period. And the other piece is in All Lives Matter. And if you kind of look at, with a question mark.
Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm having a little difficulty in figuring out where you place your incarceration as motivation.
Yeah.
Because to me, you sound like an absolutely brilliant person.
Exactly. Well, I mean, thank you, I should say.
But what I'm saying is that you shouldn't have even been there.
And that's where the motivation is. Because just like I shouldn't have been there, there are a couple million others that should, you know. Yeah, I'm not as excited. Yeah.
The point is, why should that be the motivation?
Yeah.
Because you should have been a brilliant artist, period.
Absolutely.
You shouldn't have to go there to be that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's true. I think my only response to that is, yes, sir. That's true.
I find that very, very difficult to.
But you know, I think it's also part of your journey, right? So I think that
but
you know.
Why should it be part of the journey? That's
Yeah.
my question. Why should a young, brilliant Black artist have to use prison as part of the journey?
Well, I don't think it's an issue of having to use it as much as it is that it just is. It's just a reality. It's like before I went, I was creative. I'd gone to college, played college sports. It wasn't that I wasn't a smart kid, but there was something that happened in that transformation, and it's not giving prison the credit for it. It's not giving anything any. It is just a sequence of events, and part of it for me is before that experience, I had a relative. There had been some privilege. Like I had I think enough privilege to not really fully understand that. Oh man, I got a pretty good shake of things out here. Now after that experience, I realized if I don't make the best with this pretty good shake I got of things, that I am really effing up.
Right.
I'm trying to,
Yeah.
But I think there's some understanding, and then growing up, it's not that prison makes or breaks anyone. There are a lot of people that break laws, and a lot of people that don't go to prison. And so,
Right.
like, the reality that I was breaking some laws, you know, there's about the other half of my classmates were breaking the same laws. They don't have this story because they didn't go to prison. They went on and just did whatever
Right.
they did. But I didn't have to go, you know.
Right.
But I did, and I think if I didn't recognize some of the motivation that came out of that, I wouldn't be being honest. My grandmother died the morning I got home. I got home at 10. She died at 7. So
Yeah.
if you're not like, the fuck am I doing with my life after that?
Right.
Then what's wrong with you?
But you also, I think, you know, as an artist, this work, the body of work that you've created, probably wouldn't exist without that experience.
And
it would exist differently, right?
It would exist differently.
And we talked about this yesterday. Like, I'm a survivor of incest, and so when I think about that experience, it's a horrific experience, but it certainly has shaped and informed my life in a way that I move differently than had I not had that experience. And so, you know, I'm just not one to necessarily, I question myself, and I'm striving to, you know, work on my own internal, like, challenges, but I don't really question so much the journey that this universe puts before us. And I know that, I mean, it saddened me when you first shared with me about that experience, but I also thought there's incredible beauty and resilience and strength, because you are also able to now share a story that for thousands and thousands of people who are incarcerated, they can't share that story. And so Amari gets to be this voice for us, right, of a world that even if you know someone who's incarcerated, unless you've had that particular experience, it's just not your experience. And so I think there's real power in one. I want to thank you for being such a bold and courageous truth teller and sharing your work and allowing us in. We're going to have time for just one more question. One more comment. Yes.
I want to thank you for something. Your art changed my paradigm on the whole idea of redlining, which I know because in describing it to the kids on the way here, probably being a white male, I described it as keeping people out. Right away you said it was about keeping people in. And that preposition in this case has real meaning, I think, because then the in can be literal, keeping people in their location, but also the more derogatory, keeping people in their place.
That's right.
And your view of that is probably more accurate and richer than mine. So I thank you for helping me shift my view on what that means.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for that. That's really yes.